author of the book, The End of Bias, A Beginning, which is now out in paperback. And the book looks at how people and organizations and cultures become less biased and less discriminatory, and what approaches actually allow them to become more fair and more just. Why is it so critical to address unexamined or unconscious bias when we know that explicit prejudice is also extremely important? Both are critical. Both are extremely consequential and cause real harm in people's lives, and I argue to society more broadly. I think what people might be surprised to know, though, is that the kind of subtle, ambiguous, kind of everyday bias that's so pervasive in organizations and workplaces, not to mention education and healthcare and public safety, is actually more detrimental in terms of its effect on our performance. So if we are in, say, a workplace and we are dealing with bias and discrimination that are kind of hard to pin down, not explicit, maybe there's some plausible deniability, we're not sure what's happening, that's a much bigger drain, and it has a much more negative effect on our ability to perform and do our jobs than if someone is explicitly sexist or explicitly racist. And the reason is that that kind of ambiguous discrimination is really mentally taxing, and it requires a lot in the way of cognitive resources to deal with, because there's so much questioning and second guessing, and am I overreacting? Is this person trustworthy? Can I really believe what they said? Did they really mean to say that? It's quite exhausting and taxing, and so the result is that it has a huge negative impact on our performance, and that's one of the reasons it's so important to address. Another reason it's so important to address is that it's pervasive, and if you look at the kind of patterns people experience in the workplace, if you take, for example, an African American woman who is an engineer, say a mid-level engineer at an engineering firm, the kinds of patterns of bias she's likely to face are things like being excluded from meetings, having her work credited to someone else, being criticized for seeming too aggressive or too assertive, things that are not necessarily expressed as explicit sexism or explicit racism, but have a cumulative effect that is extremely negative and consequential for her ability to do her job and for her career. How do we motivate people to change? Why should those of us who might express bias want to give it up or change? I want to answer this question with a story. Throughout most of the 20th century, in the field of ecology, scientists believed that nature was fundamentally competitive. This was throughout most of the 20th century. They saw nature as consisting of opposing species vying for limited resources. And it turns out that actually this is not the reality. Nature is suffused with cooperation, and we see mutually beneficial relationships in forest fungi interactions, in flower pollinator interactions. In fact, scientists now believe that almost every form of life is involved in some kind of cooperation or mutually beneficial relationship. So why did scientists get this wrong for so long? Well, one reason is that the group of scientists, the group of ecologists that were working on this problem were an extremely homogenous group who themselves had only really experienced a competitive environment. They were in fierce competition with one another. They were working within the Western capitalist sort of scientific establishment, and they had, for their own conceptual frameworks, a competitive framework to draw from. As people from different backgrounds and different perspectives came into the field, they brought with them perspectives that allowed for a broader view and ultimately a more correct view of how the world actually works. And so I bring this up because I think what we have to understand is that in order to progress as a society, as a species, in order to tackle the enormous global problems that we're facing, we really need everyone to participate. We need all of the perspectives we can bring in, and we need all of these backgrounds in order to be able to see what's happening clearly and accurately and be able to move forward. And so, I think that we all will benefit tremendously from tackling the kinds of bias that are currently excluding so many people from full participation. I worked on this book for about 6 years. And when I started it in early 2016, it was before the 2016 election. And what I've seen over the 6 years that I was working on the book is an increase in extremism, in white nationalism, in these kinds of more overt, explicit, quite deeply held prejudices, actually, and an increase in social norms actually making that somewhat more acceptable in the broader society. Not broadly acceptable, but within some communities, more acceptable ways of interacting and expressing themselves. And it's alarming. And if I could, I would like to write a companion book to this, which looks at how we actually combat that kind of prejudice, because it's a different approach. When you're talking about people who believe themselves to be egalitarian and who want to do the right thing and who want to treat people fairly, there's kind of a whole bevy of interventions and approaches that can be used to help people live in a way that's more aligned with their values. If you're working with people who actually hold explicit prejudices and believe in things like racial hierarchy or the value of patriarchal organizations of culture, there's a very different approach that needs to be put in place to handle those sorts of interactions. There's an approach that involves, for instance, bridging the gap between the speaker who's trying to persuade a person to change their mind and the person who is holding an explicitly prejudiced belief. And it involves making a connection between an experience that person has had of alienation, isolation, exclusion, and an experience of alienation, isolation, and exclusion of the targeted group or the stigmatized group that you're trying to talk about. And so it's an extremely important problem, and it needs a huge amount of effort and resource put into tackling it. The study of history is essential to tackling the problem of bias and discrimination. And I think there are two reasons why. One is that we know from the research that the more people understand the discrimination of the past, the more they understand the history of prejudice, the better able they are to recognize it in the present, to perceive it and really grapple with it in the present. There's an idea called the Marley hypothesis in the psychology research, named after Bob Marley, who said, if you know your history, you'll know where you're coming from. And some studies have found that, for instance, when people learn the role that the US government played in creating segregated communities, in creating housing segregation, the better able they are to perceive racism in contemporary housing and in contemporary society. And so part of the importance of history is simply the fact that when we understand the past, we can make a link between the past and the present and see what's happening in the present in a more clear and complete way. The other reason I think history is so important is that history provides us with incredible examples of places and times and cultures where our present patterns of prejudice did not exist. And when we look at these examples, this can help us see the reality that prejudice is learned, it's a human invention. It's not natural, it's not inevitable, it is culturally specific, and it is contingent. And I think that allows us to see that we have the capacity as humans to intervene on it. If we look, for example, at ancient Egypt, we see no sign of skin color prejudice. And in fact, we see Nubians from what is contemporary South Sudan rising to the very highest levels of the Egyptian political administration. We see no sign of skin color prejudice. It just was not there. If we look at an example like the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy in the Americas, We see women holding significant political power, women choosing chiefs, deposing chiefs, meting out punishment, meting out capital punishment in some cases, controlling the resources of the nation. I could go on, but I think these examples can give us courage, really, and give us a sort of sense of creativity, and allow us to imagine and build a world beyond the biases that we live with today. This idea that laws and policies create the floor, but people determine the ceiling is a critical idea. I started thinking about this through my conversations with Connie Rice, who is a civil rights attorney who spent about 15 years suing the LAPD for discrimination. What she came to understand over her career as a civil rights attorney was that laws just determine how bad things can get. They sort of put a floor under behavior, below which it can't go. And so it's a minimum standard. And if we look at the gap between that very minimum standard and how we actually want to interact with one another, how we want to interact with trust and kindness and respect and love and care, there's a very big gap. And laws can only do so much. You can't legislate kindness. I can't order you to treat me with respect. If we think about organizations and what this means for organizations, it means that policies are essential on one hand. Policies are critical. And it's also important to create cultures and norms where people behave in ways that go above and beyond those policy minimums. There are a lot of ways to do this. Creating social norms is a really good one. As humans, we are very influenced by what we see other people doing, particularly people who are thought of as popular and influential. There's some interesting work that's been done around shifting the behavior of a small group of people in order to sort of create ripples out to a larger organization or larger community. It's imperative for organizations and communities to understand that there's a lot of internal motivation that's important too. If I hold biases against you, that harms you absolutely. And it also harms me. And I think this is something that we don't talk about enough. If I'm biased toward you, this is preventing my ability to see the world clearly. It's preventing my ability to really understand what's happening. It's preventing trust between us. It's preventing us from having a meaningful connection across whatever differences we have. In addition to having sort of policies in place, I think organizations need to think about the norms of the organization, the culture of the organization, and also what every individual has to gain by tackling their own bias in the context of that community. It's so interesting, writing a book, because you're a completely different person at the end of the process than you were at the beginning, but you couldn't have become that person if you hadn't written the book. I wrote this book in order to really try to understand how people change, how people and cultures and organizations become less discriminatory and more just and fair. And to do that, I use the lens of unconscious bias to look at the ways that we interact with one another that don't align with our values, and what can be done to actually make those behaviors come more into line with our values. I think if I were to do it again, I might actually use a different word than unconscious bias. The field of psychology tends to sort of dichotomize bias and prejudice as either implicit or explicit, either conscious or unconscious. And what I've come to understand over the 6 years of research and reporting and talking to many, many experts, what I've come to understand is that that distinction is not so clear, and that in fact, our minds are kind of an unknowable combination of conscious and unconscious and implicit and explicit. And I think I would use the term unexamined bias instead, to capture the fact that some of these expressions of bias and discrimination are somewhere between conscious or unconscious, but the important thing is they haven't been examined. They haven't been really looked at carefully. That's the important distinction.